Anyway, so for those folks who don't know, I'm Lynn Richards. I'm the head of CNU, and it's my distinct pleasure tonight to announce and discuss our legacy projects that we do, as well as to welcome Stephanie Meeks, who's the president and CEO of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We're absolutely thrilled to have Stephanie with us. So CNU started the legacy projects 3 years ago in Dallas with the idea that members of the CNU are more than members of a trade association. We're more than just members of any association. We are members of a movement, and a movement that likes to give back. And so instead of volunteering at a soup kitchen, which is perfectly awesome to do, we like to donate and volunteer our time in helping communities realize what their hopes and visions for their community are. As we like to say, but for CNU assistance, a particular project would not go forth. So this year we worked in Seattle's central area and in Tukwila, Washington, which is a first-ring suburb outside of Seattle. I will say the previous 2 years in Dallas and in Detroit, it will be 7 legacy projects that we've done. 100% implementation rate. There is no other technical assistance program that is currently occurring in any placemaking organization that is at 100%. And that speaks volumes to the sheer talent that you all have, as well as the talent of the local host committee in selecting those projects and those communities that are on the cusp of implementation. So I want to talk to you a little bit about Tukwila, and as I start, I would like to invite the Tukwila consultant team up to the stage. Placemakers, no, not the electeds, you guys come later. I'd like to see placemakers. I'd like to see Steve. Where's Paul Crabtree? Bob Gibbs. Larry Paul. Come on, everyone who's whatchamacallit. So let me tell you a little bit about Tukwila. I had the opportunity to participate in this legacy project, and I was absolutely inspired. Tukwila is a small community of about 20,000. As I said, it's immediately south of the city. You might have seen it as a light rail stop on your way either to or from the airport. It's 38% immigrant and refugee. It has incredible cultural sensitivities as well as cultural challenges. It's also an economically kind of stressed and struggling community, as you would imagine. But it was given an amazing gift. It has a link rail stop. The 4 blocks preceding, leading as a gateway to the light rail stop, is what you would imagine is an arterial. How can this arterial be transformed into a vibrant main street? How can they leverage the investment, the incredible infrastructure investment of the light rail stop as an economic development boost to their downtown? And that is exactly the process that the team engaged in. It was an incredible 3 days where over 100 community members came out. Members from the refugee community, members from the immigrant community, as well as local high school students. Everybody was there. Their arms were rolled up. I don't think actually Hazel had a voice left by Sunday afternoon. But what the end result was a series of small-scale incremental improvements in the coding, street design, business development, and small-scale development. So when you're dealing with a very small town with limited economic means, it became incredibly important to think about how the city could incrementally evolve in a way that would respect the cultural significance and the cultural meanings of the town. How can you do it in a way that will allow the town to thrive and prosper while maintain those very populations in the town? So at this point, I would like to welcome to the stage Mayor Alan Eckberg, Kate Crowler, Werner Seal, Jack Pace, Maura Bradshaw, Lynn Miranda, and David Klein. One story that I need to tell you about Tukwila, which is their fire chief. So Paul Crabtree, who's not here, and when you see him, please mock him for us all. Paul Crabtree was going, everybody was working on street designs, and the fire chief came into the room, and everyone's like, oh, the fire chief. And he was, you know, and Paul's like, here's what we need to do to change the street, to look at the buildings, come on, we all know the suggestions. Let's narrow the lanes, put in a bike lane, this is what we need to do. And the fire chief said, well, of course. My job is to protect the safety and the well-being of Tukwila residents, and what you just suggested does exactly that. That, my friends, is the Tukwila team. So, congratulations. Please come to the stage, the Opticos team. Little bit of a backlog. Seattle's central area is on the east part of the city, and their application asked to collaborate with CNU to build the capacity of residents to engage in conversations to change their community. This is a very different project in a different kind of area. The central area is home to incredibly rich and diverse cultural resources. And much like many Seattle neighborhoods, it is witnessing increased investment in this area as land values rise. And this is raising concerns around gentrification, displacement, and changes to their community character. This is not unique to the central area, as this is happening in communities across the United States. The project, therefore, was not to develop a series of design guidelines and not to develop a land use plan. The project was essentially to develop a conversation whereby to further empower and engage the residents, to provide them the tools through which they could engage better in these conversations. So what the Opticos team did is, and it was a very difficult project, there were so many different players, so much history. We have all worked in areas and with clients that have had dozens of visioning, dozens of community meetings, and now here the CNU team is coming in. And so Opticos wanted a clean slate. They're like, you know what, let's just start walking the community. Let's empower the residents with a visual toolkit where they could circle what was good, they could draw in what they wanted to preserve, and they could engage with a whole series of folks about what they felt was most important. This project is less about, is this right? This project is less about a concrete deliverable and more about planting the seeds in the community about how to engage in equal footing with consultants, with developers, with the city, on what is best for their community. If we're really going to begin to address these issues of increased investment, displacement, in a way that is fair and equitable, we need to start developing tools that provides everybody with the same language, and that's exactly what the Opticos team did. So please join me in welcoming to the stage, representing on behalf of the City of Seattle and the Central Area Design Guidelines Coalition, Chen-Lin Hu and Jeff Floor. And Robert Stevens. I also had the opportunity to participate briefly in this legacy project over the weekend, and I walked into a room where everybody was engaged. It was an incredibly vibrant room with everyone with pencils, drawing, marking things, marking up the drawings on the wall, and it was one of the most diverse rooms that I have been in a long time. So huge thanks to the Obstacles team and to the Central area. Thank you very much. It is now my pleasure to introduce Kevin Daniels. Kevin Daniels has over 30 years of real estate experience with landmark structures and community redevelopment projects in Seattle. And the reason why we're introducing Kevin Daniels is because he currently is Board Emeritus of the National Trust for Historic Preservation and on the board of the National Main Street Association. Please join me in welcoming Kevin to the stage, where he will introduce Stephanie Meeks, our keynote speaker.
Everybody to Seattle, one of the few cities where you get all 4 seasons in one day, as you saw today. And you'll probably notice that everybody's looking at their phone. You're thinking they're doing something creative or anything else. No, they're looking at the weather forecast to see what time they have to get out of town and what freeway they're going to use. So I was asked to introduce Stephanie, but also put it in a little bit of context for all of you to kind of think about, well, why should you listen to her? So I'm going to do the normal thing up front very quickly and give you her background and her resume and what she's done, which is quite extensive. But then I'm also going to tell you a little bit about my experience with her on the National Trust Board. So Stephanie's been the President and Chief Executive Officer at the National Trust since July of 2010. And you'll notice I'm going to veer off from, if you're reading this, when the board was presented with a change from somebody that had been there and was an institution and still is in the preservation movement. He was chief of staff for Walter Mondale. He had all these Washington, D.C. connections, and he really led the trust into a certain statue. And I think most of you think of the National Trust as those are the people that save buildings. No, that's not where we're going. And so that's one of the reasons you need to listen tonight and really explore. The other thing I wanted to read before I do this other thing again, I never follow a script. And I thought this was very interesting because I've always paid attention to the CNU, and your charter of new urbanism says this: we stand for the restoration of existing urban centers and towns with coherent metropolitan regions. Okay? The reconfiguration of sprawling suburbs and communities of real neighborhoods. Great. And diverse districts, the conservation of natural environments, and the preservation of our Belt legacy. So with a couple of tweaks of this could be the National Trust's mission. So we are brothers in arms, sisters in arms, and as we go through and you listen to her tonight, I think that's the key. You're going to find out that the old trust is not the new trust, and that's because of this lady. So she's developed, and it's very ambitious, strategic plan to take us out of the past and refocus our direct action on saving imperiled places, engage new audiences in preservation, because we think you all are preservationists at heart, based on belonging to this organization, and increase the organization's impact by a factor of 10. Now, the other thing that she's working on is bringing more diverse communities and age groups into preservation. We all are looking at how to attract the millennials and the X's and the Y's, and having a couple of them, I still can't figure out what it is they really want to do or what it is they're going to do, but I'm sure it'll be exceptional. She's, I hope, at least in my family. So she also, and she'll get into this more, and I don't want to steal her thunder, but she highlights the critical connection between older buildings and communities and vibrant cities and how that works. She will use some exact examples, some that people that you know, some you never heard of, and should. So our organization has strategically repositioned the portfolio. We have 27 historic assets. We were formed by Congress in 1949. We got them off our back in 1998, I think, Jack, I don't know. if you have any questions, he's one of your board members, and he served on the board of National Trust with me, so he has all those answers. And she really, I mean, we focus on the same things that you all have to focus on technology and building a dynamic workplace. We're now in the Watergate, and we're in the Watergate mainly, not only because of its history, but because it needed saved. And that's a modern project, so we're not your old trust. Now, what did Stephanie do before? And this is extensive too. She was in very senior, several executive positions with the Natural Conservancy, and that's where she came over from us. So as a board member, we're looking at somebody that's never been in preservation. It was quite a challenge for us to really get our hands around that, but you'll hear why tonight and see that we made the right decision. She was also director of RARE, a US-based conservation group that uses social marketing to address environmental challenges. So she brings that in and got us to understand how to use these things the right way. I even have a Twitter account now. I actually posted today. How about that? I know. And she graduated with a degree in English from the University of Colorado. Well, I don't know what you do with an English degree besides become the president of the National Trust. So. And an MBA from George Washington University. So you didn't come here to listen to me. And so with no further ado, where are you? Stephanie Meeks, the president of the National Trust.
Well, thanks, Kevin, and it's great to be here with all of you tonight, and I also want to say thank you to Jack Davis, the Congress of New Urbanism trustee, and who was on the board when I was hired, so I have both of those gentlemen to thank for being here tonight, and especially to thank Jack, who's been talking to me about CNU since the first time I met him, and really encouraging the National Trust and CNU to work more closely together. And so I'm so delighted to be here tonight and to talk with you a little bit about the work that we're doing at the Trust and to share with you some of the highlights of my new book, The Past and Future City. I like saying my new book because it implies there's an old book, which there actually isn't. That's my only book. But I'm really happy to talk with you tonight and to be part of this 25th anniversary Congress. So a quarter century ago, when Andres Duany and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, they brought architects and builders and scholars together in Alexandria to promote a better vision for our cities. A vision, as you know, to reduce sprawl and revitalize main streets that emphasized health and well-being, walkability and sustainability, and that worked to bring the built environment back to a human scale, to forge neighborhoods that were built for people and not cars. The Charter for the New Urbanism encapsulates their vision and your vision, and as Kevin Daniels was saying just a few minutes ago, also expresses our sense of mission at the National Trust and our desire to help cities flourish through revitalization. So for 25 years now, CNU has been at the forefront of this movement, and we at the National Trust look to you for inspiration and leadership and as allies. You've galvanized architects and developers to transform our cities for the better, often by returning them to the qualities that made them so beloved in the first place. The legacy projects that we just heard about testify to that spirit of innovation and creativity that you've all nurtured here. And I just want to say thank you for the work that you do. We all benefit from it. So I know in many ways I'm preaching to the choir this evening, but it's sometimes taken a while for, and I'd say longer than it should have, for preservationists and urbanists to realize that we're arms of the same movement, sharing the same vision and the same goals. And preservation in particular has had a bad reputation in some corners, and I would say, deservedly so, for being the movement of no. The people who tell you what you can't do. But the fact of the matter is that preservation is one of the most powerful tools for urban regeneration that we have. Reusing older buildings creates jobs, and it reinvigorates local economies and helps small businesses come to life. It can help our neighborhoods be healthier and more sustainable. And it can help us grapple with many of the most intransigent urban problems we have today, like affordability and displacement, sustainability, and climate change. And it can bring communities together. So this evening, I'm going to try to make that case to all of you through the stories of some remarkable men and women who've shaped the past, the present, and the future of the preservation movement. And I'm going to start with a woman that you all know very well, the intellectual founder of both of our movements, the one and only Jane Jacobs, who of course was a journalist and an activist with no formal training in urban planning. But she was a keen observer of the world around her. She cut a really fierce figure with her trademark cat-eye glasses and her no-nonsense bob, and she was, by all accounts, fearless. Just take a listen.
The kind of planning that we ought to have should not be planning that begins with what is nasty here, what do we take out, but rather what is missing here. Which of the conditions that are needed to make this a lively and convenient place that works? Why, for instance, weren't people walking in the areas that all the artist conceptions had shown full of happy promenaders? They weren't there.
Happy promenaders. Yeah, her candor angered a lot of people, and no one more so than her principal antagonist and an unstoppable force in his own right, New York City's master builder, Robert Moses, who over the course of his career built more than 600 miles of highway, 13 bridges and 2 tunnels in New York. And Moses believed, as you all know, that cities are created by and for traffic. And to accomplish his vision, he often ripped out entire blocks of neighborhoods. But Jane Jacobs observed a different rhythm of the city, what she called the sidewalk ballet. She believed that cities are created by and for people. So when Robert Moses tried to tear down her block or run expressways through lower Manhattan neighborhoods, she helped form and lead community coalitions to stop him. Now, she didn't win every battle. She was among those who tried and failed to save New York's Penn Station. But she won more than she lost. And over the years of fighting against her nemesis, she helped articulate and then promote a vision that put front and center the many benefits that older places bring to cities. In her most famous book, and she did write more than one, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, she argued that older buildings are a critical and necessary feature of thriving neighborhoods. She wrote, and I quote, that cities need old buildings so badly, it's probably impossible for vigorous streets and districts to grow without them. They provide character and ensure mixed use. They offer space for entrepreneurs, local businesses, artists, and innovators. And today, more than a half century after she wrote those words, we now have the tools to put her theory to the test. 3 years ago, our Preservation Green Lab at the National Trust published a report that we called Older, Smaller, Better. And it evaluated the age, the diversity, and size of all buildings, not just historic buildings, in 3 cities, in Washington, D.C., in San Francisco, and right here in Seattle. And using GIS mapping technology and innovative data sources like cell phone usage patterns, we examined how each block in these cities performed according to different economic, social, cultural, and environmental performance metrics. And what we found is exactly what Jane Jacobs predicted. That neighborhoods with a mix of older and newer buildings tend to have more small business jobs and more diversity in housing costs, meaning more opportunities for families of all incomes. They have hidden density, meaning more people and businesses per commercial square foot than areas with just new buildings. They're more walkable and have more creative jobs. They have more new and women and minority-owned businesses, and they have more non-chain businesses. They show more activity on evenings and weekends. This is a map of cell phone activity on a Friday night in Seattle. And you thought it was just the NSA who was tracking where you are with your cell phones. Now you know it's the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So we now have the empirical data to back up Jane Jacobs' assertions. And since publishing Older, Smaller, Better, we've since documented the same benefits all across America. This past November, we released a new report that we're calling the Atlas of Re-Urbanism. And yes, we chose that name as an homage to the work that you all have been doing all these years. So in fact, if you go online to atlasofreurbanism.com, you can see the principles of re-urbanism that we've drafted that are inspired by your charter. The Atlas of Reurbanism applies that same methodology that we used in Older, Smaller, Better, and applies it to 50 cities across the country, and you can see them here on the slide behind me. And once again, what we found is quite remarkable. In each one of these 50 cities, when compared to areas with just new buildings, the areas with a mix of old and new buildings have 33% more new business jobs and 46% more small business jobs. These older areas have 60% more women and minority-owned businesses and more diverse populations in general. In fact, 75% of Americans of color live in these older areas. There are 27% more affordable housing units than in new areas. And in every city in the Atlas, there's greater population density and greater density of housing units on blocks with older, smaller, mixed-aged buildings. So we're really excited about what we're seeing, and because we can now prove that preservation is the path to a brighter urban future. Now, one case that I know particularly well is Denver, Colorado, because I grew up in Denver, about 70 miles north in a town called Loveland, and Denver was my first big city. And today, as you all undoubtedly know, Denver is a national leader in almost every way that counts. Its population has been growing at double the national rate. Its unemployment is hovering at around 2.5%. And thanks to its really thoughtful infrastructure, it continually ranks as one of America's fittest cities. So how does Denver become such an urban powerhouse? Well, one reason, a really big part of their success, is another fearless woman named Dana Crawford. Here she is.
I don't know whether it's genetic or not, but I'm attracted to beautiful places, and a lot of times they happen to be places that have become ignored. When I go around the country on consulting jobs and I get to the towns, I always say, take me to your pigeons and your pensioners, and then I find the beautiful buildings.
So Dana began her work in the Larimer Square neighborhood of Denver, which at the time was a pretty scary and down at the heels part of the city. As with so many other quote-unquote urban renewal plans of the 1960s, Denver was trying to revitalize its downtown by tearing it down. Already nearly 30 blocks of the historic downtown had been destroyed. Keep your eye on the bell tower on this slide behind me. So this is Denver's downtown before urban renewal, and here it is afterwards. Now, Larimer Square is in the upper right-hand corner, and it's one of the few places that survived the wrecking ball, and that's because Dana had a very different vision. She believed that people would rather live in a city that kept its historic character. Here she is again.
Well, I've been looking for quite some time since I had moved to Denver for an area where I might bring the affection that I had developed for the city of Boston to Denver, a place where we could mark the history of the community and would be a wonderful gathering place for a lot of people from all walks of life, all incomes and all backgrounds. So then when I was shopping at Goodwill Industries on Larimer Street, I did drive by the 1400 block, and I was quite fascinated by the architecture. So then I began to do research about it and found that it was in fact the block where everything started.
So with her friends and neighborhoods, she began buying the older buildings along the 1400 block of Larimer Square, which you see there, often for a little more than the price of the land they were on. Now you can tell by listening to her that she's a very dynamic woman. And by 1965, her company had acquired most of the 1400 block. To give you an idea of how Dana operates, she announced a press conference to have the mayor come and endorse her vision. And several days later, she invited the mayor to come. So Dana will tell you it wasn't always an easy lift. The banks thought she was crazy, but her instincts were spot on. And by the 1980s, Larimer Square was really on its way back and a powerful example of what could be accomplished elsewhere in Denver. Building on that example, and with important advocacy and assistance from our Denver field office, the city, I think that's me, but maybe it is. The city that worked to create a lower downtown historic district. And lightning struck twice. Today, Lodo, lower downtown as it's known, is considered the heart of the city with the lowest commercial vacancy rates around. Union Station, which is one of Dana's recent projects, has been a centerpiece of Lodo's revitalization. And yes, she is still going strong at the age of 85. Now, one of the many business owners who flocked to the downtown area was John Hickenlooper. Before he was Denver's mayor, and of course now he's Colorado's governor, he opened a brewery in Lodo with several of his friends. They bought space in the historic Mercantile Building in 1988 for just $6 a foot. And within 10 years, their investment was already worth 100 times that. Today, that same preservation-minded spirit is remaking Denver neighborhoods like Capitol Hill, Uptown, Highland, and River North. And we now have the tools and the data to replicate Denver's success all over America. And I think we have an amazing opportunity because preservation isn't just about grand mansions. It can benefit almost every neighborhood. No matter how modest, every community has places that define them and stories to tell. And every city's future is connected to its past. And of course, right now, the largest and most diverse generation in American history is leading a drive back into cities. And one of the main reasons they're coming back are historic buildings. As one young engineer in Baltimore said to me, people want a lot more authenticity in what they wear, in what they eat, and in where they live. Or in the words of Ann Olson, our partner in the Buffalo Bayou Partnership in Houston, Texas, they come for the quality of life that older places can provide. And research bears this out. In 2014, Sasaki and Associates conducted a survey in 6 cities, Austin, Boston, Chicago, New York, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C., to ask what exactly residents loved about the places where they lived. And they were surprised to discover that one of the most popular answers was historic buildings. Nearly 2/3 of the city residents that they surveyed said that they would stop and admire historic buildings while walking around, far more than said the same thing about modern buildings or skyscrapers. And when asked how firms like theirs could better improve the city's character, the most popular answer by far was renovate existing historic buildings to retain their character while making them more usable. By contrast, fewer than 1 in 5 felt like their city was too quaint, or that they really wanted more modern buildings. Now these findings align with other studies. A 2007 Gallup poll on urban life found that the strongest correlation was between happiness and those people who believe that they live in a beautiful place. Okay, it's not working. Have noted the connection between landscape and beauty in our landscape. As author Stuart Brand put it, something strange happens when a building when a building ages past a certain age, a human generation or two. Any building more than 100 years will be considered beautiful no matter what. And in fact, one of the ironies of our work in preservation today is that we're now fighting to save some of the idiosyncratic, modern, and brutalist buildings that were considered eyesores just not so long ago. And there are so many ways that cities can leverage their historic buildings. Among them, tools like flexible form-based zoning codes that allow for mixed use, and revising parking requirements to encourage walkable communities and street life. reuse ordinances and output-focused energy codes that make it easier to reuse old buildings. I could go on in detail, but I would just be telling you what you already know, because CNU has been the pioneer and the champion of so many of these smart public policies for a very long time. But they all underscore our central premise that building reuse should be the standard in our cities, and that demolition should always be the option of last resort. And above all, that we should be reusing our older buildings so that they're meeting the needs of today's citizens. These buildings don't need to be trapped in amber or sequestered behind velvet ropes. They really need to be centers of 21st century community. Some of the most exciting projects that I see when I'm traveling around the country are when theaters become churches and churches become restaurants, warehouses become art spaces, hotels become affordable housing and senior living. And at scale, these transformations really add up. To give you one particularly striking example, consider Los Angeles, the stereotypical highway city. I was just there on Monday, and there's still a lot of driving in Los Angeles. But through preservation, downtown Los Angeles is changing. 17 years ago, there was a partnership between neighborhood groups, city leaders, developers, and preservationists that led to an adaptive reuse ordinance. And it removed regulatory barriers like burdensome parking requirements that helped make it possible to repurpose more than 60 historic buildings as apartments, lofts, and hotels. Many of them were early 20th century buildings which had sat vacant for decades. And as a result, the population in these neighborhoods tripled. And downtown Los Angeles is now a thriving hub of residential and commercial enterprise with an astonishing 14,000 new housing units in older buildings. And I like to think that if it can happen in LA, it can happen anywhere in the United States. And it's important to keep in mind, and I want to underscore, that preservation can benefit everyone. It's not just about the millennials and the empty nesters. Which leads me to my third heroine tonight. Let me tell you about Mtamanika Youngblood, yet another fearless woman who helped revitalize her neighborhood through preservation. Here's Mtamanika in her own words.
In terms of ensuring that residents are involved in the planning, in the development, and obviously at the end of the day, in living in these houses is our specific focus. While we want to attract others to the community and to the neighborhood, obviously for a greater mix of incomes, which is our stated goal and intention, we are very focused on making certain that we improve this neighborhood for the benefit of those residents who are there and who have been there for the long term.
So in the early 1990s, Mtamanika and her husband bought a house in the Sweet Auburn area of Atlanta's Old Fourth Ward. You may know that Sweet Auburn was once known as the most prosperous African-American business district in the world. It's where Martin Luther King grew up, where he led his flock, and where he and Coretta Scott King are now buried. But it fell on hard times over the years. In fact, soon after Mtamanika moved in, she saw a bus of foreign tourists who were coming to visit the King history there. And she described later that they had this look of horror on their face. She said they looked as if they were in the Wild West. So Mtamanika turned to one of her neighbors and she said, "We have to do something. This just isn't who we are." And so she did. She became the executive director of an organization called the Historic District Development Corporation, and they preserve and revitalize the Sweet Auburn area and Auburn Avenue. She worked with banks and developers and community agencies to renovate historic homes throughout the neighborhood and to build compatible infill homes on nearby vacant lots. Now, all told, HDDC has redeveloped or preserved 110 single-family homes, constructed nearly 500 units of multifamily housing, and added more than 40,000 square feet of commercial space in the old Fourth Ward. And through this, they've revitalized Sweet Auburn, and they've created affordable housing units for a range of incomes without displacing a single existing family. And today, Mtamanika is applying the same principles of preservation and adaptive reuse to drive renewed commercial growth along Auburn Avenue, which you can see here on the slide. And her good work, I think, is just so important, and it demonstrates to me how history, sustainability, fairness, and economic vitality can all go hand in hand. And it's not just a one-off singular story. There are similar things happening all across the country. In Houston, artist Rick Lowe has worked to renovate and transform 22 houses in the old Third Ward to better meet the needs of that neighborhood. His work has revitalized this historic area of Houston, and he's since brought the same model, fusing historic preservation, art, community service, and revitalization to North Dallas and to Watts and to New Orleans after Katrina. In Macon, Georgia, the historic Macon Foundation has been combining preservation with a number of innovative financing tools to revitalize the Bells Hill neighborhood, which is immediately adjacent to Mercer University. With a total investment of roughly $5 million, which has mostly come from foundations, they'll transform almost 500 buildings in this historic neighborhood. Since they began their efforts, the total property tax revenue in Bells Hill has increased by nearly $1 million, most of it from rehabbing abandoned houses and building on empty land. Historic Macon also has made it a point to never displace landowners. And they do that by never acquiring an occupied house. And they're working to counter gentrification in other ways too, like recruiting low-income homeowners and advocating for property tax freezes. And the result of their work is a diverse and thriving neighborhood where longtime residents and new arrivals alike just rave about the impact of the foundation's work. In chapter 6 of my book, I go on at some length about the issue of affordability and displacement, because too often free market economists like to blame preservation for the affordability crisis in the United States. But our research suggests that this just isn't the case. As I mentioned earlier, our research shows that neighborhoods with older buildings tend to have more small businesses and diversity in housing costs. And they're also often built for more density, much more so than single-family homes. So along with creative infill and altering parking requirements, repurposing historic buildings for housing can help mitigate the housing crisis that we have in the United States. Take Louisville, Kentucky, for example, where we've been doing some work recently. The red spaces on this map of downtown Louisville behind me are surface parking lots. And the purple ones are parking garages. So clearly, there's a lot of room here in Louisville to add density without demolishing any more historic fabric. And with more than 3 parking spaces in America for every 1 car, I'm sure this holds true for a lot of other American cities as well. The fact is that in cities big and small, the best preservation projects are creating opportunities for community residents at all income levels, while retaining their local history that ties these generations together. The issues of gentrification and displacement are some of the most challenging issues facing our cities today. But there's one that may overtake them both, and that's climate change. And I want to end with this because it's an increasingly frightening problem. And given the current political environment, it's one where cities will increasingly need to take the lead. As we all know, the very existence of climate change is still being debated in some quarters. But many cities and historic sites across the country just don't have the luxury to talk about it anymore. They're already experiencing and grappling with climate change in very concrete ways. Let me tell you about another woman named Lisa Craig. She's the Chief Preservation Officer for the historic city of Annapolis, Maryland. Along the Atlantic coast, this is the city with the most 18th century structures still standing. Actually, in all of America, they have the most 18th century city buildings. In the early 1960s, Annapolis, Maryland experienced nuisance flooding, which they describe as flooding up to your knees, so it really is quite a nuisance. 3 days a year in the 1960s. Now, this is one of these cities that is subsiding, where it has land subsidence, and the sea levels are also rising. So today, they experience nuisance flooding 30 to 40 days a year. And the trend line's getting worse. By 2030, it's expected to flood every other day. And their climate models show that by 2045, it'll flood every single day in the historic part of Annapolis, which is the slide that you see behind me. Now, Annapolis has as its slogan that they're the sailing capital, but I'm pretty sure this isn't what they had in mind, that you could sail right up to the front door of some of these businesses. So working with the mayor and other city leaders, environmental scientists, as well as our team at the Preservation Green Lab, Lisa's been helping lead a program they call Weather It Together. Preservation efforts in Annapolis, what are they going to do in the face of this reality? Among the solutions that they're working on is raising historic buildings and crafting a larger seawall. But also at the same time, Lisa's part of her job is acclimating residents to the fact that this is their new reality. So the threat's very real, and it's not just Annapolis, of course. Coastal cities all over America are threatened, from New York to Norfolk, Virginia, Miami to the Gulf Coast, and San Diego, right along here to the Puget Sound. To grapple with these transformations, we all know that we need to reduce our carbon footprint as a country. And reusing historic buildings is one of the ways we can do that. In our profession, there's a saying that we're fond of, and that is that the greenest building is the one that's already built. And it's true, because our research has found that it can take decades for even the best new LEED certified buildings to make up the energy and environmental costs of demolition and new construction. In fact, the average 50,000 square foot commercial building embodies the same amount of energy as 640,000 gallons of gasoline. And when a building that could be reused is demolished, all that energy is wasted. Of course, more than just the energy is lost. Many older buildings are inherently energy efficient by design. They reflect a wisdom that's often been lost, of earlier generations that keep these buildings naturally warm in the winter and naturally cool in the summer. In fact, in 2003, the Energy Information Administration released a study that said that commercial buildings constructed before 1920 are more energy efficient than buildings constructed any time after. So encouraging building reuse and retrofits is a proven, effective way to reduce energy costs and mitigate further environmental damage. And if it's done correctly, the impact can really add up. To take just one nearby example, if the city of Portland, Oregon were to retrofit and reuse the single-family homes and commercial office buildings that they're otherwise likely to demolish over the next 10 years, they could save about 15% of their stated carbon reduction target over the next decade. So that's 15% right off the bat, just by conserving and reusing their existing buildings. I argue that I go out of my way to recycle cans and bottles and newspapers, and I know you do too, that we need to be recycling our buildings as well. So moving forward, we at the National Trust look forward to working alongside you to help cities unlock these many benefits of preservation, which I've just touched on tonight, to create jobs and to reduce energy costs, to help us come to terms with difficult chapters of our past, keep our cities affordable, sustainable, healthy, and to make us all happy. Because ultimately, we do this work, not for the buildings themselves, but for the people whose lives they make better. People like Erin Losey, who's a former Marine, who recently opened a gym with her brother on H Street in Washington, D.C., and saw it become an immediate success. That historic corridor, which is one of our official main streets, welcomed 250 new businesses and more than 3,000 jobs in just over a decade. Or Elizabeth, a formerly homeless Detroit resident who's found a home in the Michigan Bell Building. It's an old office complex that's been reconverted into apartments and a resource center for those in need. Elizabeth's now taking GED classes at the Bell so that she can have the skills to get back on her feet. She says that she thanks God every day for this place, that it's a blessing for me, a roof over my head where I have the opportunity to achieve. So older buildings don't just connect us to our past. I believe they're a cornerstone to a brighter future. And the best part is that they're right here among us. And we're richer and stronger when they remain. One small change, as we've seen tonight, can set off a ripple that helps to revitalize an entire neighborhood or city. And one person's actions can improve the lives of countless American families. Just look at Jane Jacobs, who stood up against very powerful people to save Lower Manhattan and recalibrated our understanding of what a city should be. She encouraged us to put people first again. Look at Dana Crawford in Atlanta, or Denver, and Tamanika Youngblood in Atlanta, Rick Lowe in Houston, and the historic Macon Foundation, Lisa Craig in Annapolis. Look at Andres Duani and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberg. Look at the activists and thinkers who came together 25 years ago in the first ever New Urbanism Congress. I look at tonight's legacy projects and look at the work of so many of you that you're engaged in your own communities. Together, we're creating the foundation for a better future. We're transforming people's lives and enriching our cities as never before. We, all together, are making a difference. Thank you tonight. Happy silver anniversary to CNU, and here's to many more. Thank you.
I was going to ask Stephanie a couple of questions, and you know what? Nope, we're not going to do it. That was just absolutely amazing. Thank you, Stephanie. Stephanie will be signing books out in the lobby, and so good night. Have a wonderful evening. Please buy one of her books, have her sign it, and we'll see you all tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.